If you are enjoying this video, smash that like button, subscribe, and hit the bell. Share it with your friends, and let me know in the comments where you are watching from. Every like and subscribe helps the channel grow. My name is Michael Blackwood, and this happened to me in 1995 when I was working as a ranger in Denali National Park, Alaska. I never thought I'd tell this story to anyone, but some things just don't let you forget them, no matter how hard you try. I remember it was early November when things started getting weird. Up here in Alaska, we're used to long nights during winter, but what happened that year was different, very different. It started with the phone calls. People kept reporting that their watches were showing wrong times. Hikers would come back from short trails thinking they'd been gone for just an hour, only to find out they'd been missing for days. Animals were acting strange too. We found moose and bears wandering around in circles, like they'd forgotten where they were supposed to go. But the thing that really got my attention was the northern lights. Now, I'd seen aurora borealis hundreds of times before. It's part of life up here. But these lights, they were wrong. Instead of dancing across the sky in green and purple waves, they seemed to be forming patterns. Sometimes, I swear they looked like letters in a language I couldn't read. Then, the missing persons reports started coming in. First, it was just a couple of hikers, nothing too unusual for this time of year. But then, we lost contact with an entire research station. 6 people, all experienced scientists, just gone. Their last radio message still gives me chills. All they said was, "The darkness, it's alive." I should have been more scared, I suppose. But after what happened to my brother Jack 3 years ago in a similar situation, I felt like I was finally getting close to some answers. You see, Jack disappeared while investigating strange lights near the Arctic Circle. They never found him, and I've been looking for answers ever since. Little did I know, I was about to find out exactly what happened to Jack, and I'd wish I never did, because some truths are better left buried in the eternal darkness of the Alaskan winter. The morning I headed out to check on the research station, something felt off. The sun should have risen by now. It was 10 a.m., but the sky stayed dark. Not just normal winter dark, but a thick, heavy darkness that seemed to swallow my flashlight beam. I remember checking my radio one last time before leaving the ranger station. "Base, this is Blackwood. Starting my drive to Paradise Valley Research Station. Over." Static. Just static. The drive usually takes 2 hours, but that day, time started playing tricks. My truck's clock kept jumping forward and backward. 1 minute it showed 10:15, the next 9:45. Then suddenly, 11:30. I tried not to panic, but my hands were getting sweaty on the steering wheel. About halfway there, I saw something that made me stop the truck. There was a moose standing in the middle of the road. Nothing unusual about that, except it wasn't moving. At all. Like it was frozen in time. When I shined my flashlight on it, I saw its shadow on the snow. But the shadow was moving while the moose stood still. I drove around it slowly, keeping my eyes on it in the rearview mirror. That's when I noticed something even stranger. My own reflection in the mirror looked older, maybe by 10 or 20 years. I rubbed my eyes, and when I looked again, everything was normal. But I knew what I'd seen. The research station came into view at last, or what was left of it. The main building was there, but it looked wrong, like someone had painted it with darkness. Not just dark-colored actual darkness that moved and shifted when you looked at it. The windows were black, but not because the lights were off. It was like they were filled with ink. I parked the truck and grabbed my gear, flashlight, radio still dead, and my old service pistol. I didn't think a gun would help against whatever was happening here, but its weight on my hip was comforting. As I walked toward the building, my flashlight started flickering. With each flicker, I saw the northern lights reflect off the snow, but they were forming shapes I'd never seen before. They looked like doorways, hanging in the air, opening and closing. The station door was open, swinging gently even though there was no wind. Inside, my watch stopped completely. The air felt thick, like walking through cold syrup. And somewhere in the darkness ahead, I heard something that sounded like whispers, but not in any language I knew. I took a deep breath and stepped inside. I had no idea that I was walking into something that would change not just my life, but my understanding of reality itself. Inside the research station, everything was covered in frost, even though the heating should have been on. My breath came out in white puffs, and the beam of my flashlight showed papers scattered everywhere, coffee cups still half full but frozen solid. "Hello?" I called out. "This is Ranger Blackwood. Anyone here?" The only answer was my own voice, echoing back strangely, like it was coming from different directions at once. I found the main lab first. 6 desks, 6 computers, all still running but showing nothing but strange patterns on their screens. What caught my eye was a video camera on one of the desks. When I picked it up, it still had some battery life. My hands were shaking as I pressed play. Dr. Sarah Chen's face appeared on the small screen. She looked scared. "Day 15, she whispered. "The darkness. It's not just absence of light. We can see things moving in it. Time isn't working right anymore. Tom aged 30 years in 5 minutes yesterday, then went back to normal. The aurora. It's trying to tell us something. We found symbols in the ice cave below the station. They're the same ones that appear in the lights. If anyone finds this..." The video cut off there. Ice cave? I didn't know about any ice cave. But as I stood there thinking, I heard something that made my blood run cold, footsteps, coming from the ceiling above me. Not on the floor above, but actually on the ceiling of the room I was in. I pointed my flashlight up. Nothing was there, but the footsteps continued, getting closer. Then they were on the wall, then behind me, then everywhere at once. That's when I saw it, my shadow on the wall. It wasn't moving with me anymore. It turned its head to look at me, even though I was standing completely still. The temperature dropped even more. The northern lights suddenly shone through every window, but they were black instead of green. They formed a pattern that looked like a door right there on the wall in front of me. And through that door, I saw something that answered the question I'd been asking for 3 years. What happened to my brother Jack? Through that strange door of black light, I saw Jack, but not like I remembered him. He was both young and old at the same time, like those double exposure photographs. He was trying to say something, his mouth moving, but no sound came out. I stepped closer, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. "Jack?" My voice cracked. "Is that really you?" He pointed urgently at something behind me. I spun around and saw all the shadows in the room peeling off the walls like wet paper. They weren't just dark spots anymore. They had depth, like holes in reality, and something was crawling out of them. I ran, down the hallway, past the frozen computers, past my own shadow that wasn't following me anymore. I needed to find that ice cave Sarah mentioned in her video. If the symbols were connected to all this, maybe they could explain what was happening. I found the entrance behind a storage room, a heavy metal door with frost all around its edges. It took all my strength to pull it open. Steps led down into darkness, carved right into the ice. As I started down those steps, my flashlight showed something that made me stop breathing for a second. The walls weren't just ice, they were covered in the same symbols I'd seen in the aurora. They seemed to pulse with a faint light of their own. But that wasn't the scariest part. No, what really got me were the people frozen in the ice walls. The missing research team, they were all there, suspended like insects in amber, their faces frozen in expressions of wonder, fear, I couldn't tell, and they were all pointing at something deeper in the cave. Then I heard it, a sound like 1,000 whispers all at once coming from below. The symbols on the walls started glowing brighter, pulsing like a heartbeat, and my flashlight began to flicker again. I knew I should turn back. Everything in my body was screaming at me to run, but I couldn't. Not when I was this close to finding out what happened to Jack, to these researchers, to everyone who had disappeared. So I took another step down, and another. The whispers got louder. The symbols glowed brighter, and somewhere in the darkness ahead, something was waiting. At the bottom of those ice steps, I found a huge round room, like a giant bowl carved into the ice. But what I saw there, I still have trouble believing it myself. In the center stood something that looked like a tall black pillar, but it wasn't solid. It was more like a piece of the night sky had been pulled down and twisted into shape. The northern lights, but pitch black, swirled around it like water going down a drain. As I got closer, my watch started spinning wildly. Forward, backward, the hands just spinning and spinning. The air felt heavy, like being deep underwater. And then I saw them, all the missing people, including Jack. But they weren't frozen anymore. They were walking around the pillar, but something was wrong. Some looked young, others old, and they kept changing as they walked. It was like watching someone's whole life flash by in seconds. "Jack!" I shouted. My voice sounded weird, like I was talking through a long tube. He turned to look at me, and for a moment, he was exactly as I remembered him. "Mike," he said, his voice somehow clear despite the whispers all around us. "You shouldn't have come. Time, it doesn't work right here. The darkness, it's alive. It's been here forever, waiting." Before I could reach him, the black pillar changed. It started spreading out like spilled ink. The whispers got louder, turning into a sound that made my teeth hurt. And then I saw it, a face in the darkness. Not a human face, not an animal face. Just eyes, hundreds of eyes, opening all at once. Jack grabbed my arm. His hand felt ice cold. "Run," he whispered. "Run now. I'll hold it back. I'm not leaving you again." I tried to pull him with me, but my hand went right through his arm. He smiled sadly. "I'm not really here anymore, Mike. None of us are. We're part of it now, part of the long dark." The darkness was spreading faster now, reaching out with hands made of shadow. The other people, the researchers, the missing hikers, they all turned to look at me. Their eyes were black, like the northern lights above. I ran. I ran faster than I've ever run in my life. Behind me, I heard Jack's voice one last time. "Don't look back, Mike. Whatever you do, don't look back." But of course, I did look back. And what I saw, when I looked back, the darkness was rushing up the stairs like a flood of black water. But that wasn't the worst part. In that darkness, I saw pieces of time itself breaking apart. I saw myself as a kid, as an old man, as someone who never existed, all at once. The symbols on the walls were glowing brighter than ever now, burning with that strange black light. And through the darkness, I saw Jack one last time. He was standing in front of the shadow thing, his arms spread wide, like he was trying to hold it back. I ran up those stairs so fast, I don't even remember my feet touching them. The shadows were right behind me, grabbing at my legs with cold fingers. My flashlight died completely, but the black aurora lit up everything in a weird way that hurt my eyes. Just as I reached the top of the stairs, I felt something grab my ankle. It was ice cold and strong. I fell forward, hitting the frozen floor hard. When I rolled over, I saw my own shadow holding on to me, trying to pull me back down. That's when I remembered something my grandfather once told me about the northern lights, that they could sometimes be used as a weapon against dark spirits. I pulled out my phone, turned on its flashlight, and pointed it at the ceiling. The light bounced off a piece of ice, splitting into colors like a rainbow. The shadow creature screamed, not with a voice, but with a feeling that made my head feel like it was going to explode. It let go of my ankle, and I scrambled to my feet. I ran through the research station, past all those frozen computers, past the desks with their cold coffee cups. Behind me, the darkness was destroying everything it touched. The walls cracked, the floor buckled, and time itself seemed to be falling apart. I made it to my truck just as the research station collapsed in on itself. As I drove away, I watched in my rearview mirror as a perfect circle of darkness spread out from where the station had been. Nothing grows there anymore. No animals go near it. And at night, the northern lights avoid that spot like they're afraid of it. But the story doesn't end there, because something followed me out of that place. When I got home that night, I knew something was different about me. My reflection in the mirror wasn't quite right. Sometimes it moved a split second after I did. And I started seeing things that weren't supposed to be there. The first sign was my clock. Every night at exactly 3:33 a.m., it would start running backward. I'd wake up to find all the clocks in my house showing different times, like they couldn't agree on when it really was. Then the shadows in my house started acting strange. They'd stretch in ways shadows shouldn't, especially when I was alone. Sometimes, late at night, I'd see my shadow sitting in my living room chair while I was in bed. But the worst part? I started getting messages from Jack. Not phone calls or letters, no, these were different. I'd find words written in frost on my windows, even in summer. Simple things like "miss you" or "be careful" or "it's still watching." The northern lights changed for me too. Now I can read them like a book. They tell stories about the darkness, about the people it's taken over the years. Sometimes on really dark nights, I see faces in them. All the missing people, including Jack, looking down at our world from up there. I tried telling people what happened, but the government showed up at my door pretty quick. They said the research station had burned down in an accident. All records of the missing people were gone, like they never existed. They even had newspapers from that time with different stories in them. But they couldn't hide everything. Every year, that dark spot where the station used to be gets a little bigger, and sometimes, on the darkest winter nights, people still go missing there. Their shadows stay behind for a few days, walking around like normal, before they fade away too. I'm telling this story now because last night, I looked in the mirror and saw myself aging 20 years in just a few seconds. I think the darkness is finally catching up to me. And if you're ever in Denali National Park and see strange lights in the sky that look black instead of green, if you ever see those black lights, here's what you need to know, and this might save your life. First, don't look at them directly for too long. The longer you stare, the more they'll pull you in. I've seen people walk right into the darkness while staring up at those lights, like they were hypnotized. Second, check your shadow. If it's not moving exactly when you move, run. Run as fast as you can in the opposite direction of those lights. Don't stop until you see normal colors again. Third, and this is important, if you hear whispers that sound like someone you lost, someone you miss more than anything, don't answer. That's how it tricks you. That's how it got Jack. That's how it gets most people. I'm writing all this down now because yesterday, I noticed something in my house that scared me more than anything else. All my photographs are starting to change. In each one, I'm getting older, while everyone else stays the same. This morning, I looked like an old man in my driver's license photo, but the date shows it was taken just last year. The darkness isn't finished with me. I think it's just been patient, waiting all these years. Last night, I saw Jack again, standing in my backyard. He looked young, just like the day he disappeared. He was pointing at something behind me, just like he did in the research station. I'm not going to look this time, but I can feel it there, getting closer. My shadow is stretching across the floor as I write this, even though the sun went down hours ago. If you're reading this, and you ever find yourself up in Denali during the long dark of winter, remember my story. Remember that some mysteries should stay mysteries. And if you see a ranger there who looks both young and old at the same time, who seems to cast no shadow, well, now you know why. Because time caught up with me in the end. Or maybe I caught up with time. These days, I'm not sure there's really a difference anymore. My name is Marcus Walsh, and this happened to me back in 1963, when I was serving as Chief Ranger at Yellowstone National Park. I was 45 then, and even after everything I'd seen in Vietnam, nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered that summer. Let me tell you how it all began. It was a bright July morning, but something felt off right from the start. You know that feeling when the hair on the back of your neck stands up? Yeah, that kind of morning. I remember checking my watch. It was 7:15 a.m., and I was doing my usual patrol with Rex, my German Shepherd. I'd been working at Yellowstone for nearly 8 years by then. After losing my wife Sarah to cancer 2 years before, this park had become my whole world. The other rangers used to joke that I knew every tree and rock in my section. Maybe they weren't wrong. This place was my home, and I thought I knew all its secrets. But that morning changed everything. The first strange thing I noticed was the temperature. Now, July in Yellowstone is usually pretty warm, but that day, my breath was coming out in white puffs. The thermometer in my truck had dropped from 75 degrees to 45 in just minutes. Rex, who was usually eager to run ahead on our patrols, stayed close to my leg, whining softly. That's when I saw it, something that still gives me nightmares. About 50 yards ahead, there was a bison carcass. Now, finding dead animals isn't unusual in my line of work, but this was different. The bones were cleaned so perfectly they looked polished, and they were arranged in a pattern I'd never seen before. It wasn't random. Someone or something had placed them deliberately. I've tracked bears, wolves, and mountain lions, but in all my years as a ranger, I'd never seen anything like this. The symbols carved into the nearby trees made my blood run cold. They reminded me of something White Eagle, my friend from the Crow tribe, had once warned me about, something called the hunger that walks. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of the most terrifying 3 weeks of my life, a story that would cost me 3 fingers, my partner, and nearly my sanity. After calling it in on my radio, I took some photos of the bison carcass and those weird tree carvings. Within an hour, other rangers showed up, including my partner Thompson. He was a young guy, maybe 30, who always had a joke ready. But that day, even he went quiet when he saw what we were dealing with. "Chief," Thompson said, his voice shaking a bit, "you ever seen anything like this before?" I shook my head. 20 years of experience, including my time in Vietnam, and this was new. The bones weren't just clean. They were arranged in a perfect spiral pattern, like someone had used a protractor. The marrow was completely gone from each bone, almost like they'd been surgically emptied. While we were examining the scene, my radio crackled to life. It was Betty from dispatch, and her voice was tense. "Marcus, we've got a situation. 3 hikers have been reported missing since last Tuesday. The Mitchell family, parents, and their teenage son. They were supposed to check in at the Highland Creek campground, but never showed." My stomach dropped. Highland Creek was just 2 miles from where we stood. That's when Rex started acting stranger than before. He's a trained search dog, never backs down from a trail. But when I tried to get him to track any scents from the bison scene, he tucked his tail between his legs and backed away. I'd only seen him do that once before, when we had that big forest fire in '61. Thompson suggested we head to Highland Creek right away. As we walked back to our vehicles, I noticed something that still bothers me when I think about it. Despite the unusually cold temperature, there weren't any birds singing. The forest was dead quiet, except for the crunch of our boots on the ground. I checked my lucky compass, the one my war buddy gave me before he died in Nam. The needle was spinning wildly, something I'd never seen it do before. I didn't tell Thompson, but right then, I knew we weren't dealing with any ordinary missing persons case. Just before we got in our trucks, White Eagle's words from years ago echoed in my mind. He told me stories about his tribe's warnings, about things that lived in these woods long before humans came. Things that hungered for more than just flesh. I grabbed my rifle from the truck, checked my flashlight, and made sure my first aid kit was packed. Whatever we were about to find at Highland Creek, I had a feeling we'd need to be prepared for the worst. If only I'd known then just how right I was. The drive to Highland Creek took about 20 minutes. Neither Thompson nor I said much. We were both too busy thinking about those clean bones and strange markings. As we got closer to the campground, the temperature kept dropping. The truck's thermometer now showed 40 degrees, which made no sense for a July afternoon. "Look at that," Thompson pointed through the windshield. A thick fog had settled over the campground, even though the sky above was clear blue. Rex started whimpering in the back seat. We parked and grabbed our gear. The Mitchell family's campsite was supposed to be in Area C, near the creek. As we walked, our footsteps seemed too loud in the unusual silence. No squirrels, no birds, not even insects making noise. Then we saw it. The campsite was a mess, but not in a way that made sense. The family's tent wasn't just knocked down, it was shredded into perfect strips, like someone had used scissors. Their belongings were scattered around, but what caught my eye were the strange things hanging from the trees. "Chief," Thompson's voice cracked. "Are those bone-wind chimes?" They were. Small bones, probably from rabbits and squirrels, hung from branches in complex patterns. Each one had those same strange markings we'd seen on the trees near the bison. My training kicked in, and I started looking for tracks. That's when things got even stranger. There were bloody footprints, but they didn't make any sense. Some led up trees. Others just stopped in the middle of nowhere, like whoever made them had vanished into thin air. We found the first body about 50 yards from the campsite. It was Mr. Mitchell, but something was terribly wrong. His body looked like a dried-up mummy, even though he'd only been missing for 10 days. The weird part was how clean the wounds were, like someone with surgical training had removed his organs. I'd seen some horrible things in Vietnam, but this was different. This was calculated, precise, almost ritualistic. Rex, who was usually great at tracking, wouldn't go near the body. He kept backing away, growling at something in the trees that neither Thompson nor I could see. "We need backup," I said, reaching for my radio. But all I got was static and a strange, high-pitched sound that made my teeth hurt. That's when we heard it, a voice calling for help. It sounded exactly like a young boy. "Help, please, somebody." Thompson started to move toward the sound, but I grabbed his arm. Something wasn't right. The voice was too clear, too perfect, like a recording being played through a good speaker. "That's not the Mitchell boy," I whispered. "Whatever you do, don't." Before I could finish, the temperature plunged another 10 degrees, and the fog grew so thick I could barely see Thompson standing next to me. Then we heard the voice again, but this time it was behind us, and it wasn't calling for help anymore. It was laughing. The laugh wasn't human. It sounded like breaking ice and grinding bones mixed together. Rex started barking like crazy, then suddenly turned and ran back toward the truck. I'd never seen him do that before. "Thompson, back to back now," I ordered, remembering my Vietnam training. We pressed our backs together, both of us drawing our service revolvers. The fog was swirling around us in a way that didn't look natural, like it was alive. Then we saw the shadows. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. Dark shapes moved through the fog, but they weren't solid. They looked like smoke, but moved like people. One second they were tall and thin. The next, they were crawling on all fours. "Chief," Thompson's voice was shaking. "The trees! Look at the trees!" Ice was forming on the tree trunks around us. Not frost, thick, clear ice, spreading upward from the ground like someone was painting it on. In July. In 75-degree weather. I clicked on my flashlight, and that's when I saw something that made my heart stop. In the beam of light, about 20 feet away, stood what looked like Mrs. Mitchell. But something was wrong. Her skin was stretched too tight over her bones, and her eyes were completely white. "Sarah?" she called out in my dead wife's voice. "Sarah, why did you leave me, Marcus?" My hand started shaking. How did it know about Sarah? How did it know my name? Thompson let out a gasp. "Chief, over there! And there! They're everywhere!" More figures were appearing in the fog. Some looked like the Mitchells, others like people I'd known who died years ago, each one calling out in voices they shouldn't have known. I fumbled for my radio again. "This is Chief Walsh. We need immediate backup at Highland Creek Campground. Code." The radio exploded in my hand, showering us with sparks. The temperature dropped another 15 degrees. I could see my breath coming out in thick clouds now. That's when Thompson screamed. I spun around and saw him staring at something behind me, his face white as a sheet. Slowly, I turned. There it stood, at the edge of our flashlight beams. Tall, maybe 8 feet, and thin as a skeleton. Its skin was gray like old ice, and its fingers were long bone needles. But its face, I'll never forget its face. "Run!" I yelled, grabbing Thompson's jacket. "Back to the truck! Now!" We ran through the fog, jumping over fallen logs, pushing through branches. Behind us, that horrible laugh echoed through the trees, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. What happened next? Well, that's when things got really bad. And I mean really bad. We ran as fast as we could through the fog. The thing, whatever it was, wasn't just chasing us. It was playing with us. Sometimes its laugh came from in front, sometimes from behind. The shadows kept dancing around us, making it hard to know which way to run. "The truck," Thompson shouted. "I can see the truck." But when we got there, Rex wasn't inside. The doors were open and frost covered all the windows. My hands were so cold, I could barely hold my flashlight. That's when Thompson grabbed my arm. "Chief, look at your compass." My lucky compass was going crazy, spinning faster and faster. Then it just shattered. The glass broke and the needle fell off, like something had pulled it apart from the inside. We heard Rex barking in the distance, back toward the campsite. Thompson looked at me, and I knew what he was thinking. "We can't leave him," he said. He was right. Rex was family. So we loaded fresh bullets in our guns and headed back into that nightmare fog. The ice was spreading everywhere now, covering the ground, making it hard to walk without slipping. That's when we heard Mrs. Mitchell's voice again, but this time it was different. She was crying, begging for help. It sounded so real, so scared. "Please, my son. Someone help my son." Thompson took a step toward the voice. I tried to stop him, but he shook his head. "Chief, what if we're wrong? What if they're still alive?" Before I could answer, something dark moved in the fog behind Thompson. It was like a piece of the shadow had torn itself loose. As it got closer, I saw those long bone fingers reaching for his shoulder. "Thompson, duck!" He dropped just as I fired my revolver. The shadow thing screeched, a sound like metal scraping on ice, and disappeared. But we could still hear it moving around us. Rex's barking was getting closer. Then we heard him yelp, and everything went quiet. "Rex!" I shouted. "Here, boy!" The only answer was that horrible laughing again. But now it was using Rex's barks between the laughs, mocking us. Thompson's flashlight beam caught something in the trees. Bones. Hundreds of bones, hanging like Christmas decorations. They weren't just animal bones anymore. Some were human. "Chief," Thompson whispered, his voice shaking. "What is this thing?" Before I could answer, the fog around us turned into solid ice, trapping us in a frozen clearing. And there, standing in the middle of it all, was the creature. In the flashlight beam, I finally saw its face clearly, and I understood why White Eagle's people called it the hunger that walks. Its face was like a human skull wrapped in gray ice, with black holes where the eyes should be. But those holes weren't empty. They had tiny blue lights floating in them, like stars in a dark sky. When it opened its mouth, I saw rows of teeth made of what looked like icicles. Marcus Walsh, it spoke, using all the voices we'd heard. My wife's, the Mitchells, Rex's barks, all at once. Vietnam couldn't kill you. Cancer couldn't break you. But I will collect you. Thompson fired his gun. The bullets hit the creature but went right through, like shooting at smoke. It just laughed that bone-chilling laugh again. Then I saw Rex. He was frozen solid, turned into an ice statue mid-run. My heart felt like it was being squeezed in my chest. That dog had been my only family since Sarah died. The creature moved closer, walking on those long bone-needle legs. Each step it took left patches of ice on the ground. The temperature must have been below zero now. "Thompson," I whispered. "When I say run, you run. Don't look back." "But Chief, that's an order." I remembered something White Eagle had told me years ago. These creatures, these winter spirits, They feed on fear and pain, but they hate fire. I pulled out my Zippo lighter, the one I'd carried since Nam. The creature was only 10 feet away now. I could smell its breath, like an open freezer filled with rotten meat. "Hey, ugly," I shouted. "You want to collect something? Collect this." I threw the lighter at my feet, right where I'd spilled some fuel from my backup gas can earlier. The ground erupted in flames. "Run!" Thompson took off running. The creature screamed, a sound like breaking glass, as the fire caught its legs. But then something went wrong. Instead of burning, the creature split into 3 shadow forms. 2 of them went after Thompson. The third came for me. I ran through the trees, my lungs burning from the cold air. Behind me, I heard Thompson scream, not in fear, but in pain. I wanted to go back, but I knew if I did, we'd both die. I ran until I found an old mine shaft, one I knew from my patrols. As I ducked inside, I heard Thompson's voice echo through the trees. "Chief, help me. Something's happening to me." His voice changed as he spoke, becoming more like the creature's. And that's when I realized this wasn't going to end with just running away. I had to stop this thing, or it would keep hunting, keep collecting. Inside the mine shaft, in the beam of my flashlight, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The walls were covered in bones, hundreds of them, and they were arranged in patterns that looked like mathematics. That's when I heard Thompson's footsteps at the mine entrance, but I knew it wasn't really Thompson anymore. What stepped into the mine shaft looked like Thompson, but wasn't him anymore. His skin had turned gray like old ice, and his eyes had those same floating blue lights in them. His fingers were stretching, turning into long bone needles. "Chief," he said, but his voice kept changing between Thompson's and the creature's. "It doesn't hurt anymore. Join us. Join the collection." I backed deeper into the mine shaft, my flashlight beam showing more and more bone art on the walls. Then I remembered something else White Eagle had told me. These creatures, they don't just kill for food. They collect bones to build something ancient. "Thompson, if you're still in there, fight it," I shouted. He tilted his head in a way that no human neck should bend. "Thompson is part of us now, just like your Rex. Just like Sarah will be when we find her bones." That made me angry, really angry. Nobody talks about Sarah like that. My flashlight beam hit something on the wall, a small leather pouch with Crow tribe symbols on it. I recognized it from White Eagle's teachings. A medicine bag, he'd called it. Only for the darkest of spirits, he'd said. I grabbed it just as Thompson Thing lunged at me. His bone needle fingers missed my throat by inches. The mine shaft was getting colder and colder. Ice was forming on my eyebrows and in my beard. "You can't fight us, Marcus," it said in Sarah's voice. "We are the hunger that walked these lands before your kind came." But I had an idea. The medicine bag felt warm in my hand, even in all this cold. I ripped it open and found what looked like red sand and small bones inside. Thompson Thing came at me again. This time, his fingers caught my left hand. The pain was horrible as the ice spread through my fingers. I knew right then I'd lose them to frostbite if I survived. But that didn't matter now. With my good hand, I threw the medicine bag's contents right at his face. The scream that came out of him wasn't human or animal. It was like the sound of a glacier breaking apart. The blue lights in his eyes flickered. The red sand started glowing as soon as it hit him. Thompson's body, or what used to be Thompson, began to crack like breaking ice. The creature inside him screamed again, trying to escape, but the sand was trapping it. "Chief." For just a second, I heard the real Thompson's voice. "End it. Please." My heart felt heavy, but I knew what I had to do. I grabbed my flashlight, the heaviest one we were issued, and swung it as hard as I could. Thompson's frozen form shattered like a glass statue. The creature tried to reform into its shadow shape, but the red sand kept glowing brighter. It was like a mini sun in the dark mine shaft. The thing made one last terrible screech. Then, it just disappeared, like smoke in the wind. The temperature started rising immediately. Water dripped from the melting ice on the walls. But I knew this wasn't over. There were still 2 more shadow forms out there. I heard movement deeper in the mine shaft. My flashlight beam showed me something I'll never forget, a massive wall of bones, arranged in a giant circle. In the middle was a shape, like the creature was trying to build something, or someone. That's when I heard the other 2 shadow forms coming. Their bone needle feet made clicking sounds on the mine floor. I had no more medicine bag, 3 frozen fingers, and my gun was empty. But I had one last thing, an old grenade I'd kept from Vietnam. Against normal enemies, I'd never use it in a mine shaft. But these weren't normal enemies. I pulled the pin, waited 2 seconds, and threw it at the bone wall. Then I ran as fast as I could toward the entrance. The explosion wasn't just loud, it was like thunder underground. The whole mine shaft started collapsing. I could hear the shadow creatures shrieking as their bone collection fell apart. I barely made it out before the entrance caved in. The morning sun was rising, and in its light, I watched the last pieces of ice melt away from my frozen fingers. I knew they were gone for good. Later, when other rangers arrived, there wasn't much to show what had happened. The mine shaft was collapsed. Thompson's body was never found. Even the bone arrangements had disappeared. But every year, on that same July day, strange bone patterns appear near Highland Creek. And sometimes, on cold nights, rangers report hearing a laugh that sounds like breaking ice. I spent 3 weeks in the hospital after that night. The doctors couldn't understand how I got such severe frostbite in the middle of summer. They had to remove 3 fingers from my left hand. Every time they asked what happened, I just told them it was a mining accident. Who would believe the real story? The official report said Thompson went missing in the line of duty. They listed the Mitchells as victims of a bear attack. That's easier for people to accept than the truth. The only one who knew what really happened was White Eagle, who nodded quietly when I told him everything. "The hunger will sleep now," he said, "but it never dies. It only waits." I found Rex's body after the ice melted. I buried him under his favorite tree near my cabin. Sometimes I still think I hear his bark in the distance, but I know better now. I know what makes those sounds. I stayed on as chief ranger for another year, but things were different. Every time the temperature dropped suddenly, my missing fingers would ache. Every time I heard a strange voice in the woods, I'd reach for my flashlight. The nightmares never really stopped. In them, I see Thompson's face changing, hear those voices calling out, feel that bone-chilling cold. But the worst part is what I found in that mine shaft, that wall of bones arranged in a circle. Sometimes I wonder what the creature was trying to build, what ancient thing it was trying to bring back. Last week, a new ranger found some strange bone arrangements near Highland Creek. The temperature dropped 30 degrees in that area, even though it was a warm day. I told them to leave it alone. Some things are better left undisturbed. I'm retiring next month, moving somewhere warm where ice never forms. But before I go, I needed to tell this story. Because I know that somewhere in these woods, in the deepest shadows, the hunger still walks, and it's still collecting. So if you're ever hiking in Yellowstone, and the temperature suddenly drops on a summer day, if you hear a voice calling that sounds too familiar, or if you see strange shadows moving through the trees, don't stop, don't look back, just run. And whatever you do, don't answer when it calls your name. My name is William Harrison, but everyone calls me Will. This happened to me back in 1985 when I was working as a forest ranger in Olympic National Forest, Washington. I've been keeping this story to myself for years, but I think it's finally time to share what really happened in those woods. I was 34 then, living alone in a small cabin near the ranger station. After losing my smoke jumper team in a terrible fire 3 years before, I'd taken this quieter job to escape those memories. Well, that, and to deal with my drinking problem. The peaceful forest work was supposed to help me heal. Funny how things turn out. It all started on a foggy Tuesday morning in late October. The air was crisp, and fallen leaves crunched under my boots as I did my usual morning patrol. Everything seemed normal at first, the kind of normal I'd gotten used to after 2 years of working these trails. The tall Douglas firs stretched up into the mist, their branches dripping with morning dew, and somewhere in the distance a woodpecker was tapping away at a tree. But then I noticed something weird. The birds had stopped singing. All of them. Just complete silence. If you've spent any time in forests, you know that's not natural. It's like when you're about to have a really bad storm, and all the animals know it before you do. Except there wasn't a storm coming. The weather report had promised a clear week ahead. That's when I saw it, something that still haunts my dreams. A massive old cedar tree with what looked like dark red sap oozing from its bark. Except it wasn't sap. When I touched it, it was warm. And red. Blood red. Real blood. I've seen a lot of strange things in my years as a ranger, but nothing like this. I remember standing there, my hand shaking as I pulled out my radio to call it in. That's when I heard the sound, a low, pulsing thrum coming from somewhere beneath my feet, like a giant heart beating under the forest floor. Little did I know, this was just the beginning. The forest, my forest, was waking up, and it was hungry. I stood there frozen, my radio still in my hand, when I heard twigs snapping behind me. Turning around, I saw something that made my heart skip a beat, a herd of deer running past me. Not just a few, but dozens of them. They weren't calmly moving like deer usually do. They were running scared, their eyes wide with fear. That's when the mist started doing something strange. You know how fog usually just floats around? Well, this mist was different. It started forming shapes, long, pointed shapes that looked just like teeth. I rubbed my eyes, thinking I was seeing things. But no, they were still there, these ghostly white teeth floating in the air. I've been in these woods long enough to know when something isn't right. My hands were shaking as I finally used my radio. Base, this is Will. We've got a situation out here on Trail 27. Static. Just static. I tried again. Nothing but that crackling noise. The weird thumping under my feet was getting stronger now. If you've ever stood near a big speaker playing bass, it felt kind of like that. Boom, boom, boom. The whole ground was shaking with each pulse. That's when I spotted the totems. There's this old Native American trail marker near my patrol route. Beautiful wooden carvings that had stood there for decades. But now, someone or something had broken them apart and put them back together all wrong. The heads were upside down, arms sticking out at weird angles. It looked like a child's nightmare. I'm not ashamed to admit it. I was scared, really scared. But I'm a ranger, and it's my job to figure out what's wrong in my forest. So I took out my notebook and started writing down everything I was seeing. The blood on the trees, the running animals, the mist, the totems. I needed proof that this was real. The sun was getting higher now, but it felt darker somehow. And colder. Much colder. That's when I heard the first scream. Not a human scream, but not quite animal either. It came from deep in the forest, and it sounded like, well, like nothing I'd ever heard before. I knew I should head back to the station and get help, but something kept me there, staring into those woods. Maybe it was my training, maybe it was curiosity, or maybe the forest wanted me to stay. Looking back now, I wish I had run as fast as those deer, but I didn't. Instead, I took my first step deeper into the woods, not knowing that my whole life was about to change forever. As I walked deeper into the woods, the mist grew thicker. My boots made squishing sounds on the wet ground, but something wasn't right about that either. The ground felt soft, almost like it was breathing under my feet. I kept thinking about my old team, the smoke jumpers. If they could see me now, walking alone into this mess, they'd probably call me crazy. Maybe I was, but after losing them in that fire, I'd learned that sometimes the scariest things aren't what you can see, it's what you can't see. That's when I found the first real sign that something was terribly wrong. There was a hunter's camp, or what was left of it, The tent was torn to shreds, but not like a bear attack. I'd seen plenty of those. No, this was different. The tent looked like it had been pulled apart from the inside out, like something had grown through it. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking a bit. "Forest Service? Anyone here?" The only answer was that strange heartbeat sound, getting louder. Thump, thump, thump. I checked the camp carefully. The sleeping bags were still there, along with a half-cooked meal in a pan. Coffee in a pot was still warm. Whoever had been here left in a hurry, maybe just an hour or two ago. Then I saw the trees around the camp. They weren't standing straight like they should. Instead, they were leaning in, all pointing toward the tent. And their branches. Their branches looked like hands reaching down. My radio crackled to life, making me jump. "Will, come in. Will." It was Sarah from the base station, but her voice was breaking up. "Sarah, this is Will. I'm at an abandoned camp on Trail 27. Something's very wrong out here. Will, hunters, missing, 3 days, get out." 3 days? Missing hunters? My stomach turned to ice. This camp looked fresh, but if Sarah was right, that's when I saw it. A boot sticking out from under some leaves. My hands shaking. I brushed the leaves away. I wish I hadn't. The boot wasn't just lying there. There were roots growing through it. And it wasn't empty. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding. In all my years as a ranger, I'd never seen anything like this. The roots weren't just around the boot. They were growing through it, through everything, like dark veins spreading through the forest floor. And they were moving. I backed away from the boot, my whole body shaking. That's when I heard voices, whispers that seemed to come from the trees themselves. Not like wind in the leaves, but actual words I couldn't quite make out. I pulled out my flashlight even though it was daytime. The mist had gotten so thick that the forest was as dark as evening. The beam showed something that made my blood run cold. The trees were different now. Their bark had these weird patterns, like faces frozen in screams. "This isn't real," I whispered to myself. "This can't be real." But it was, and it got worse. The ground started moving under my feet, not just shaking anymore, but actually shifting. Like thousands of worms were crawling just beneath the surface. I tried to run, but my boots kept sinking into the soft earth. That's when I noticed the smell, like wet rot, and something metallic, like old pennies. My radio crackled again. This time it wasn't Sarah's voice. It was different, like many voices talking at once, but backwards and distorted. Then I saw them, the missing hunters, or what was left of them. They were standing between the trees, but they weren't quite human anymore. Their skin had turned a greenish gray, and small branches were growing out of their shoulders. Their eyes were open but completely black, like empty holes. They didn't move. They didn't speak. They just watched me. I've dealt with bears, mountain lions, and angry moose, but nothing had ever scared me like this. My training told me to stay calm, to think logically. But how do you think logically when the whole forest is coming alive around you? One of the hunter things took a step toward me. Its movements were jerky, like a puppet on strings. Where its foot touched the ground, dark veins spread out through the dirt. "Stay back," I shouted, pulling out my service revolver. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold it. The thing that used to be a hunter opened its mouth. What came out wasn't a voice, but the sound of creaking wood and rustling leaves. I knew I had to get out of there, but as I turned to run, I realized something horrible. The trees behind me had moved. The path I'd come from was gone. The forest had teeth, all right, and I was trapped in its mouth. I did the only thing I could. I ran. Not toward the station, those trees were too thick now, but sideways, pushing through branches and jumping over fallen logs. The hunter things followed, moving in that weird, jerky way. They didn't run, they just glided, like they were part of the forest itself. My lungs were burning, and my legs felt like lead. 20 years of working in forests, and I'd never run like this. Behind me, I could hear them getting closer. That awful sound of creaking wood and rustling leaves. Then I tripped. My foot caught on something, a root that hadn't been there a second ago. I fell hard, and my flashlight went flying. In its spinning beam, I saw something that made me forget how to breathe. The trees were moving. Not swaying in the wind, but actually walking. Their roots pulled up from the ground like legs, and they were closing in around me. "Help!" I screamed into my radio. "Anybody! This is Ranger Harrison. The forest is—" That's when the spores hit me. They came floating down like golden snow, beautiful but terrifying. As soon as I breathed them in, everything got weird. The trees seemed to glow from within, and I could hear them thinking. Yes, thinking. Their thoughts were old and slow, like mountains dreaming. I tried to get up, but my body felt heavy. The forest floor was pulling me down, soft like a bed, but hungry like a mouth. The hunter things were getting closer. One of them reached out with a hand that was more branch than flesh. Through my foggy mind, I remembered something. Something important. My lighter. Every ranger carries one, it's basic equipment. With shaking hands, I pulled it out. The hunter things stopped. The trees stopped. Everything stopped. They were afraid of fire. Of course they were. The forest remembered fire. I held up the lighter, my thumb on the wheel. "Stay back," I said, my voice hoarse. "Stay back, or I swear I'll do it." The forest seemed to hold its breath. The hunter things swayed like trees in a wind I couldn't feel. They were waiting for something. But what? That's when I heard it. A deep rumble from far below, like the mountain itself was waking up. And I realized that everything I'd seen so far was just the beginning. The ground split open about 50 feet away from me. Not like an earthquake, more like something was pushing up from below. The trees around it bent away like they were making room. A dark shape rose from the hole, bigger than anything I'd ever seen. It looked like a giant tree trunk at first, but it was moving like a snake. The surface wasn't bark. It was more like skin, dark and wet, with patterns that glowed slightly green. And faces. Dozens of faces pressed out from inside it like people trying to break free. My lighter suddenly felt very small in my hand. The hunter things dropped to their knees, like they were bowing. The whispers in the trees got louder, and now I could understand some words. "Join us. Stay. Become." The spores in my lungs were making everything spin. I could feel something happening to my skin. It felt tight and itchy, like bark was trying to grow over it. Looking at my hands, I saw tiny green veins spreading under my skin. That's when I remembered the fire that killed my team. I'd always blamed myself for not saving them. But now, holding that lighter, I realized maybe I could save someone else. Maybe I could stop whatever this thing was before it took more people. "I'm sorry," I whispered. Not sure if I was talking to the forest or my old team. I flicked the lighter. The flame looked so small against all that darkness. But I knew what fire could do to a forest. I'd seen it before. The thing from underground made a sound, not a roar, but more like trees breaking in a storm. It knew what I was thinking. The hunter thing started moving toward me faster now, their wooden fingers reaching. I had to make a choice right then. Either let the forest take me, or... Want to know what I chose? Because whatever I did next changed everything, not just for me, but for the whole forest. I threw the lighter, not at the hunter things, but at the dry leaves near the giant trunk thing. The flame caught quickly. It had been a dry October. The fire spread faster than I'd ever seen, like the leaves were made of paper. The forest screamed. Not just the thing from underground, but everything. The trees, the hunter things, even the ground itself seemed to cry out. The hunter things backed away from the flames, their wooden parts catching fire. I ran. My legs felt like they were turning to wood, but I ran anyway. Behind me, the fire was spreading through the treetops. The giant thing from underground was thrashing around, trying to escape back into its hole. But something was wrong. The spores in my body were changing me. I could feel the forest in my head trying to take over. My skin was hardening, and small twigs were starting to grow from my arms. "Got to keep moving," I gasped. Through the smoke and flames, I saw lights ahead, flashlights. Search parties. They must have come looking when I didn't check in. "Help!" I screamed, but my voice sounded like breaking branches. The fire was everywhere now. Trees were falling, and that thing from underground was making the ground shake as it tried to escape. I could barely see through the smoke, barely breathe. Then hands grabbed me, human hands. It was Sarah and two other rangers. They were wearing gas masks. "Will, oh God, Will." Sarah's voice was muffled through her mask. "What happened to you?" I couldn't answer. The forest was still in my head, screaming as it burned. The last thing I saw before passing out was the giant trunk thing sinking back into the ground, leaving a massive hole behind. I woke up 3 days later in a hospital. The doctors couldn't explain what was wrong with me. My skin was normal again, but something had changed inside. Want to know what happened after that? Because the story doesn't end there. The forest, it's still out there, and part of it is still inside me. The government people came to the hospital while I was still recovering. Men in dark suits who asked lots of questions and took lots of notes. They said the forest fire had burned nearly 500 acres before they contained it. Official story? Lightning strike. But we all knew better. My body looked normal again, but I was different inside. I could feel it. Sometimes when I touched plants, they would grow toward me like they knew me. And the dreams. Every night I dreamed of that thing underground, still waiting, still hungry. They quarantined the whole area, put up fences with environmental research zone signs. But I knew what they were really doing. They were trying to keep whatever was in there from getting out. Sarah visited me before I left the hospital. She told me they'd found more bodies in the woods, all of them half human, half tree. The hunters who'd gone missing over the years, now they knew what happened to them. But they couldn't tell their families the truth. "What about the hole?" I asked her. "The one that thing came from?" "Filled in," she said. "Concrete. Lots of it. But Will." She looked around to make sure no one was listening. "The trees near it? They're growing through the concrete. And at night, people say they can still hear that heartbeat sound." I never went back to being a ranger. Couldn't. But sometimes, when I'm near trees, I can hear them whispering. They remember me. And sometimes, on quiet nights, I can feel that thing underground, still alive, still waiting. The forest has teeth. I know because I've seen them. And somewhere deep in those woods, they're growing stronger, getting ready. For what? I don't know. But I do know one thing. Part of me is still there, growing in those dark woods. And sometimes, when I look in the mirror, I see bits of bark under my skin, spreading little by little, day by day. Want to know the scariest part? This all happened 38 years ago. But just last week, I got a letter from Sarah. She says the trees are moving again. Sarah's letter shook in my hands as I read it. There were new disappearances in Olympic National Forest. Not just one or two people, but entire camping groups. And the trees, they were forming circles again, just like before. I didn't want to go back. But Sarah included some photos that made my blood run cold. The same bleeding trees. The same mist with tooth-like shapes. And something worse, new totems appearing in the forest. But these weren't made by any Native Americans. They were made of twisted branches and bones, arranged in ways that hurt your eyes to look at. Last night, I drove up to the edge of the quarantine zone. The fence was still there, rusty now, with faded warning signs. But something was different. The trees beyond the fence were taller, darker somehow, and they were all leaning toward me, like they knew I was there. I got out of my car and walked to the fence. My hands started tingling, and I felt that familiar itch under my skin. The bark patches that I usually hide under long sleeves started spreading. Standing there, I could hear it again, that deep heartbeat from underground, stronger than before. My phone rang. It was Sarah. "Will," her voice was shaking, "they found another camp today, But this time there was a message, written in the dirt. What did it say? I asked, already knowing it was meant for me. It said, "The forest remembers its children. Come home, Will." As I stood there, a single golden spore floated over the fence and landed on my hand. Where it touched, my skin turned to bark instantly. The forest was calling me back. And the worst part? Part of me wanted to answer. I'm writing this down now because people need to know the truth. If you're reading this and you hear about missing people in Olympic National Forest, or if you see trees bleeding or mist that looks like teeth, run. Run as fast as you can. Because the forest isn't just alive, it's hungry, and it's patient, so patient. And me? Tomorrow, I'm going back. Not because I want to, but because I have to. Something tells me I'm the only one who can stop it this time. If I don't make it back, well, at least now you know what really lives in those woods. Just remember, if you ever hear trees whispering your name, don't answer. Don't even listen. Because once the forest gets in your head, it never really leaves. My name is David Cooper, and this happened to me back in 1992 when I was working as a park ranger at Mount Rainier National Park in Washington. I never thought I'd be telling this story, but what I experienced there changed my life forever. Before everything went wrong, I was just a regular ranger with a bit of a different background. I used to be an acoustic engineer, someone who works with sound. It all started on a chilly October morning. I remember it clearly because that was when we first noticed something wasn't right with the animals. Birds were acting crazy, falling right out of the sky, with blood coming from their ears. Deer were running around in circles, bumping into trees like they were dizzy. Even the squirrels, usually so good at keeping their balance, were falling off branches. At first, we thought maybe there was some kind of sickness going around. But then the hikers started coming down from the mountain trails, complaining about weird headaches and hearing things that weren't there. Some said they heard singing coming from the peaks, but when other people stood in the same spot, they heard nothing. I was especially interested because of my background with sound, but also because of something personal. My sister Sarah had disappeared on this same mountain 3 years ago. They never found her, and I took this ranger job partly hoping I might find some clues about what happened to her. The other rangers thought I was just being paranoid when I started setting up sound equipment around the park, but I knew something was wrong. You see, I have this ability called perfect pitch. I can identify any musical note just by hearing it, and the sounds I was starting to hear on that mountain, they weren't natural, not at all. I didn't know it then, but those first strange signs were just the beginning. What happened over the next few weeks would make me question everything I thought I knew about sound, nature, and reality itself. And by the time I figured out what was really going on, it was almost too late. I set up my sound equipment at different spots around the mountain, mostly in places where hikers reported hearing the strange noises. My old work habits from being a sound engineer came in handy. I had microphones that could pick up sounds humans can't hear, and machines that could show sound patterns on a screen. The first week was quiet, almost too quiet. The animals were still acting strange, and more hikers were coming down with bad headaches. But it wasn't until late one night, while I was checking the equipment near Paradise Ridge, that I heard it. It started as a low hum, kind of like when you're near power lines, but different. I checked my equipment. The readings were going crazy. The sound kept changing, getting higher and lower, making patterns I'd never seen before. My head started to hurt and I felt dizzy. Then I saw something that made my blood run cold. A group of crystals on the rock face near me started vibrating, not just shaking, but actually giving off a faint glow in rhythm with the sound. I tried to record it, but every time I got close with my equipment, it would stop working. The next morning, I found 3 more dead birds near my equipment. Their ears had burst, just like the others. But what really scared me was finding a hiker's camera. When I checked the pictures, I saw something strange in the background, weird patterns in the air, like heat waves, but forming shapes that shouldn't be possible. I knew I needed help. This was bigger than anything I could handle alone. So I called Dr. Emily Chen, a geologist I knew from college, and Mike Sullivan, another sound engineer. They arrived 2 days later, bringing more equipment and fresh eyes to the mystery. But the mountain had other plans for us. The night they arrived, the sounds got stronger. And that's when we discovered the cave, a perfectly round opening in the rock that seemed to appear out of nowhere. The walls were covered in those same crystals I'd seen before, but bigger, much bigger. Emily said something that stuck with me. "David, these formations, they're not natural. Someone or something made these." We didn't know it then, but finding that cave was our first step into a nightmare that would change everything. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I couldn't help but wonder, had Sarah found this place too? The real horror was just beginning, and none of us were prepared for what we would find deeper in that mountain. We decided to explore the cave the next morning. Looking back, maybe we should have waited for backup, but we were too curious. Emily, Mike, and I packed our gear, flashlights, rope, water, and of course, my sound equipment. The park rules say never to go caving alone, so we left a note at the ranger station about where we were going. The cave entrance felt wrong somehow. It was too perfect, too round, like someone had carved it with a giant compass. The air coming out was warm, which was strange because mountain caves are usually cold. Our flashlight beam showed those glowing crystals everywhere, covering the walls like frozen lightning. "Listen," I whispered as we walked deeper. There was a soft humming, like a faraway tune you can barely hear. Mike's equipment started acting up, the screens showing weird patterns I'd never seen before. Emily kept touching the walls, saying the rock formation didn't make any sense. Then we found the first body. It was old, maybe decades old, but perfectly preserved. A climber, judging by the old-style gear. But something was wrong with their head, like it had collapsed inward. Emily nearly threw up when she saw it. I couldn't help thinking about Sarah. We should have turned back right then. But about 50 feet past the body, we found something impossible. A huge round room, perfectly smooth, with crystals arranged in spiral patterns on the walls. In the center was a stone pillar with carvings I'd never seen before. Mike pointed his camera at the pillar, but it died instantly. So did our phones. The humming got louder, and I felt pressure building in my ears. That's when the crystals started glowing brighter, pulsing like a heartbeat. "We need to leave," I said. "Now." But as we turned to go, the humming changed to a high-pitched sound that made our heads spin. Emily grabbed her ears and screamed. Mike fell to his knees. The sound was like nothing I'd ever heard. It felt alive somehow, like it was reaching into our brains. I grabbed them both and we ran. The whole cave seemed to be vibrating now. Behind us, I heard something that sounded like laughter, but not human laughter. It was more like the mountain itself was laughing. We made it out, barely. But that night, as we sat in the ranger station trying to make sense of what we'd seen, we all knew one thing. Whatever was in that mountain, it knew we were there now. And I had a terrible feeling it wasn't going to let us go. That night at the ranger station, none of us could sleep. Emily kept drawing the strange symbols we'd seen in the cave, while Mike worked on our broken equipment. I sat by the radio, listening to static and trying to make sense of everything. Around midnight, the power went out, not just in our station, but across the whole park. The backup generator kicked in, but it made this weird whining noise, like it was struggling against something. Then our ears started popping, like when you drive up a mountain too fast. "Do you hear that?" Mike whispered, his face pale in the emergency lights. We all did. That same humming from the cave was now coming through the walls. But this time, it had a pattern, almost like words, but not in any language I knew. The radio crackled to life by itself. Instead of static, it played sounds that made my skin crawl, like thousands of voices whispering all at once. Our coffee cups started vibrating on the table, and the windows rattled in their frames. Emily grabbed my arm suddenly. "Look," she pointed outside. Through the window, we could see those strange patterns in the air again, like ripples in water, but vertical. They were moving towards the station. Then all our equipment turned on at once. Computers, phones, even Mike's broken cameras. Each screen showed the same thing. Sound waves forming into a shape that looked almost human, but not quite. The humming got louder, and I felt blood trickle from my nose. Mike and Emily had it too. The pressure in our heads was unbearable. Through the window, I saw the patterns getting closer, more solid. They were taking shape into something. That's when I remembered something my sister wrote in her last journal entry, which the search team found after she disappeared. The mountain doesn't just make sound, it uses it. And it's trying to talk to us. I grabbed Emily and Mike. We need to get to the basement, now. The basement was our old records room with thick concrete walls. As we ran down the stairs, I heard the windows upstairs shatter. We huddled in that basement for hours, listening to sounds no human should ever hear. Something was moving around upstairs, something that made the air itself vibrate. But in that concrete room, we were safe, for now. When morning came, we found the station trashed. Every piece of glass was shattered, and all our equipment was fried. But worst of all, burned into the walls were those same symbols from the cave. The mountain wasn't just making noise anymore, it was hunting us. The next morning, we knew we needed help. I called Dr. James Martinez, a weather expert I knew, because the sky above the mountain was doing things I'd never seen before. Clouds were swirling in perfect circles, and hikers reported hearing thunder that lasted way too long. While waiting for James, we went through the old records room, looking for anything similar happening before. That's when Emily found something interesting. A dusty box marked 1952 Incident. Inside were old photos and reports about weird sounds and missing people, just like what was happening now. But what really got my attention was a yellowed letter from a Native American elder. It talked about the voice in the mountain and warned people to stay away from caves that sing. The letter mentioned a special room deep in the mountain where ancient tribes used to play music to keep something calm, something that lived in the sound itself. Just then, James arrived. He took one look at his weather equipment and turned white. "This isn't possible," he said. "The air pressure around the mountain, it's creating patterns I've never seen, like something's controlling it." We showed him the cave photos and the letter. While we were talking, Mike burst in. "You need to hear this," he said, holding up a recorder he'd left running overnight. He played it back, and we all froze. It was a voice, but not human. It sounded like wind and thunder mixed together, making words. "Found. You. Sarah. Others. Mine." My heart stopped when I heard my sister's name. The voice continued, becoming clearer. "Come back to chamber." Emily grabbed my arm. "David, look!" Through the window, we could see those air patterns again, but now they were forming into shapes that looked like people walking, dozens of them, all heading toward the cave. "Those patterns," James whispered, "they're not just sound waves, they're memories of everyone the mountain has taken." The radio crackled again, and through the static, we heard something that made my blood run cold, my sister's voice, singing a song she used to sing when we were kids. But it was wrong, distorted, like something else was trying to use her voice. We all knew what we had to do. The cave was calling us back, and this time, we had to go deeper, find that ancient chamber the letter mentioned. It was the only way to understand what this thing was, and maybe, just maybe, find out what happened to Sarah. But first, we needed to prepare. Because whatever was in that mountain, it wasn't just making sound anymore. It was using it to hunt, to remember, and to call others to it. And we were next on its list. We spent the next day getting ready. James built special earplugs that could block out the dangerous sounds but still let us hear each other. Mike fixed some of our equipment and made it stronger by wrapping it in thick rubber. Emily found old maps of the cave system that no one had looked at in years. I couldn't stop thinking about Sarah's voice on that radio. Was she still alive somewhere in that mountain? The thought kept me awake all night. The next morning was strangely quiet. Too quiet. No birds singing, no wind blowing. Even the trees seemed to be holding their breath. We packed our bags with water, food, extra batteries, and emergency flares. This time, we brought climbing gear too. Remember, I told everyone, if your ears start bleeding or you feel dizzy, we turn back right away. They nodded, but we all knew we probably wouldn't turn back. Not now. We were too close to answers. As we walked toward the cave, our compasses started spinning in circles. The air felt heavy, like just before a big storm. The entrance looked bigger than before, and those strange crystals were pulsing with a faint blue light. James checked his weather equipment one last time. The air pressure, it's all wrong. It's like the mountain is breathing. We turned on our headlamps and stepped into the cave. The humming started right away, but different this time, almost like it was happy to see us. Our footsteps echoed weirdly, like the cave was changing the sound. We passed the first chamber we'd found before, but kept going deeper. The tunnels twisted and turned, always going down. The crystals got bigger, and the humming got louder. Then we found something new, a huge crack in the wall with hot air coming out. "Look at this," Emily said, shining her light on the wall. There were more of those strange symbols, but also something else. Handprints pressed into the solid rock, like the stone had been soft as clay when they were made. Mike's equipment started picking up something. "Guys," he whispered, "there's a pattern in the sound. It's like a heartbeat." That's when we heard Sarah's voice again, echoing from deeper in the cave. "David, follow the song." We all looked at each other. We knew this could be a trap, but we had to know. We squeezed through the crack, following the voice and the heartbeat sound. What we found on the other side changed everything we thought we knew about Mount Rainier, and about sound itself. The passage through the crack led us to something incredible, a massive underground chamber bigger than a football field. But it wasn't like any cave I'd ever seen. The walls were perfectly smooth, covered in those glowing crystals, all arranged in spiral patterns that seemed to move when you looked at them too long. In the center stood a circle of stone pillars, each one covered in those strange symbols. And floating in the air between them was something that made us all stop breathing for a moment. A shape made of pure sound waves, visible in the air like a heat mirage, but moving with purpose. "David." Sarah's voice came from everywhere at once. But it wasn't just her voice anymore. It was mixed with others, hundreds of them, all talking at once. Our equipment went crazy. Mike's sound meters exploded. James's weather tools spun out of control. The humming grew so loud it made our teeth hurt, even with the special earplugs. Then we saw them. Human shapes formed from those weird air patterns, walking around the pillars. Some were hikers, some looked like they were wearing really old clothes, and among them was Sarah. But she wasn't solid. She was made of sound waves, just like the others. "It's been collecting them," Emily whispered, her voice shaking. "All the people who disappeared. It's been turning them into music," I finished. The truth hit me like a punch to the gut. The mountain wasn't just making sounds, it was taking people and turning them into living sound waves. Suddenly, all the shapes turned to look at us. The humming changed to a high-pitched screech. The crystals started glowing brighter, pulsing like crazy. The air itself seemed to come alive. "Run!" I yelled, but as we turned to escape, the crack we'd come through sealed itself shut. We were trapped. The sound shape started moving toward us. Sarah's face appeared in front of me, but it wasn't really her anymore. Her mouth opened, and what came out was the voice of the mountain itself. "Join our song." We backed up against the wall as the shapes came closer. The sound was so powerful now it was making the rock shake. And that's when I noticed something strange about the pillars. They weren't just decorated with symbols. They were instruments, ancient ones. I realized what we had to do. But I knew if I was wrong, we'd all end up like Sarah, part of the mountain's endless song. The old letter had mentioned something about playing music to keep the mountain calm. Looking at those stone pillars, I suddenly understood. They weren't just decorations, they were like giant flutes, designed to play specific notes. "The pillars!" I shouted over the deafening noise. "We need to play them! Emily, James, take the ones on the left! Mike, help me with these!" The sound shapes were getting closer. Sarah's face kept changing, mixing with other faces, all of them screaming without making a sound. The air was so thick with sound waves that it was hard to breathe. We ran to the pillars. Up close, I could see they had holes in them, like ancient flutes. The wind rushing through the cave was already making them whistle softly. Each pillar made a different note. "What do we play?" Mike shouted, his hands shaking. I closed my eyes, listening carefully through the chaos. Under all the screaming and humming, there was a pattern, a simple melody repeating over and over. With my perfect pitch, I could hear it clearly. "Follow my lead." I started blocking and unblocking holes in the pillar, playing the melody I heard. The others caught on quickly, each playing their part. At first, nothing happened. The sound shapes kept coming closer. Blood started dripping from Emily's nose. James fell to his knees, holding his head. But then, something changed. The crystals pulsing started matching our melody. The horrible screaming began to fade. The sound shapes stopped moving. Sarah's face appeared in front of me one last time. For just a second, she looked like herself again. She smiled, a sad, gentle smile, and whispered, "Thank you." Then, everything went crazy. The chamber filled with blinding light. The sound became so intense that even with our earplugs, it felt like our heads would explode. The last thing I remember was the floor shaking and rocks falling from the ceiling. I woke up outside the cave, along with the others. We were all alive, but something was different. I couldn't hear anything. The mountain had taken my hearing as its final price. When we finally got back to the ranger station, nobody believed our story. How could they? We had no proof. All our equipment was destroyed, and the cave entrance had collapsed completely. Search teams tried to find it later, but it was like it had never existed. The official report said it was just a small earthquake that caused some strange sounds. They explained away the missing people as normal hiking accidents. But we knew the truth. I never got my hearing back. The doctors couldn't explain why. There was no damage they could find. It's like the mountain took my hearing as payment for letting us go. Sometimes I think it's better this way. I can't hear if it ever starts singing again. Emily, Mike, and James stayed in touch, but we never talked about what happened in that chamber. Emily quit geology and moved to Florida, as far from mountains as she could get. James still studies weather patterns, always watching for those strange circles in the clouds. Mike never recorded another sound. He became a writer instead. But here's the strangest part. A week after it happened, I got a package in the mail. Inside was Sarah's old journal, the one that went missing with her. On the last page was a new entry, written in her handwriting. "We are part of the song now, David. Don't try to find us. Some music isn't meant for human ears. The mountain is quiet these days. The animals have returned, and hikers don't report headaches anymore. But sometimes, on very still nights, people say they see strange lights near the peak and feel a vibration in their chest, like a giant heartbeat deep underground. I still work as a ranger here. Someone needs to watch, to listen, even if I can't hear it anymore. Because I know the truth. The mountain isn't just a mountain, it's an instrument. And somewhere deep inside, an ancient song is still playing, with my sister's voice among the chorus. Just remember, if you're ever hiking on Mount Rainier and you hear singing coming from a cave, cover your ears and run. Run as fast as you can. Because once the mountain's song gets in your head, it never really leaves. And sometimes, late at night, even though I'm deaf, I swear I can still feel that melody vibrating in my bones.